Today, we are going to discuss the subjects of gender dysphoria and teenage suicide. Now, we will cut to the chase. God, whether you believe in God or not, He believes in you. God made you who you are. We can choose to walk in His will, or we can live by our own will. Now, before the ridicule and before all of the, well, I don't identify as that, just answer this simple question. Were you born with the XX or the XY chromosome? We realize that the argument imposed will be, we aren't talking about sex, we are talking about gender. We will get to this. So you have the XY chromosome. Generally, the color blue is associated with you, but you prefer the color pink. You find yourself more into dance and singing than into football. But these things that you like don't make you lean towards a feminine persona. It doesn't make you any less of a man. This is where the problem with society and social media comes in. A man can like anything they want to, as can a woman. Their interests don't make them one sex or the other, just as their sexual interests don't. What makes them is their biological parts. You can choose to say you feel like one or the other, but it is quite simple. You are what God made you. God wasn't confused when you were made. Today's woke society is pushing for gender identity pronouns and pushing the transgender agenda. While trans individuals are just wanting their rights addressed fairly, it is creating dissension and more separation amongst the people. Now, if you're a man and you happen to be into other men, well, you might be one of two things. You might either be a gay man or quite possibly a bisexual man, but you are still a man. You might have soft traits, but you are still a man. You might like to wear women's clothes, but you are still a man. Being a man isn't a bad thing. For that matter, neither is being a woman. The question is, why can't you feel proud in your skin? Why turn away from what God gifted you with? It's life. Do you think He made a mistake giving you life? For decades, gay individuals were shunned or disowned, banished, or subject to even far greater consequences, like execution. The death penalty is the legally prescribed punishment for same-sex sexual acts in Brunei, Iran, Mauritania, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and in the northern states in Nigeria, which is absolutely horrible. As of December 2020, 81 countries had laws against discrimination in the workplace based on sexual orientation. 20 years ago, there were only 15. Now gay citizens are recognized as part of society. There is no reason to hide your feelings for the same sex. It isn't necessarily part of God's will. That part's on us. He did give us free will, so it is our choice to love who we will or be attracted to who we will. So there are lots of men who want to identify as women and vice versa, women wanting to identify as men. It still astonishes a lot more conservative and traditional people in the world. A lot of gender dysphoria comes from someone being attracted to a member of the same sex. Now, some may speculate that this isn't true, and we would have to agree for older generations, but gender dysphoria is happening more so now in the current generation of teens than in any other generation, much of it based off of confusion of their sexual orientation. Gender dysphoria is a term that describes a sense of unease that a person may have because of a mismatch between their biological sex and their gender identity. This sense of unease or dissatisfaction may be so intense it can lead to depression and anxiety and have a harmful impact on daily life. In some cases, adults are coaching confused teenagers and youth to feel uncomfortable with their natural gender or cisgender are another problem, especially in America. Doctors, school counselors, and teachers are keeping gender dysphoria a secret from the children's parents, encouraging these young and troubled minds to start hormone therapy. Some have even gone as far as buying binders for young girls. Binders, if you didn't know already, are garments used to compress and conceal breast areas on young and confused teenage girls. More teenage girls suffer from gender dysphoria these days than boys. Between 2016 and 2017, the number of gender surgeries for natal females in the US quadrupled. In the UK, the rates of gender dysphoria for teenage girls are up 4,400% over the previous decade, an ailment that typically began in early childhood and overwhelmingly afflicted males suddenly has a new dominant demographic: teenage girls. In 2016, Brown University public health researcher Lisa Littman was scrolling through social media when she noticed that a group of teenage girls from her small town in Rhode Island, all from the same friend group, had come out as transgender. Intrigued by the statistical unlikelihood, Littman began to study the phenomenon and, in 2018, published the results. She hypothesized that transgender identification had become one more peer contagion among adolescent females. Anxiety-ridden middle-class girls, once engaged in cutting or anorexia, were now wearing binders, breast-compressing undergarments, taking testosterone, and undergoing voluntary double mastectomies. Abigail Shriber, author of the new book Irreversible Change, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, interviewed over 4 dozen families whose teen daughters became caught in this current. Their stories follow a pattern. A girl never expresses any discomfort with her biological sex until puberty, when anxiety and depression descend. The girl struggles to make friends. She immerses in social media and discovers transgender gurus. Or her school holds an assembly celebrating gender journeys, or hosts a gay-straight alliance club pushing gender ideology. At first, she tries out a new name and pronouns. Her school encourages her, keeping all this secret from her parents. Then, she wants more. In earlier times, when a girl liked to get dirty like the boys and climb trees, these girls were referred to as tomboys. So many women were once tomboys, inhabiting femininity, itchily, like the floral dress their mothers made them wear. There was nothing wrong with a young lady back in the 80s and the 90s, doing the same things the boys did. She was strong, cool, interesting, and was fun to be around. And then, as she got older, those habits got a little more intense, like mountain climbing and base jumping. But still, she was a woman, and no one looked at her as a boy or a man. She liked to wear jeans and t-shirts most of the time. She was considered laid back, one of the guys, but she was still a woman. But tomboy doesn't exist anymore, as any teenage girl will tell you. In its place is an endless litany of gender categories, from agender to non-binary, gender fluid to trans. Imperfectly feminine girls are encouraged to consider their options. Our culture has both made womanhood less appealing and greased the skids towards social and medical transition for confused teens in genuine pain. Public schools peddle gender ideology with a fervor that would make a preacher blush. Transgender social media gurus tout the euphoria testosterone produces, and Planned Parenthood is one of the largest suppliers of testosterone, and they do apprise of the risks, but on an informed consent basis, meaning no therapist note is required, and you leave the clinic with a very serious drug based essentially on the patient's self-diagnosis. Hundreds of plastic surgeons are happy to offer medically unnecessary double mastectomies to girls as young as 16 without so much as a therapist note. Teens today spend far less time in person with friends than in any previous generation. Most of their social life occurs online, where feelings of inadequacy run wild, and the challenge of making and keeping friends never lets up. One of the surest ways to win friends and followers is by declaring a glamorous new gender identity, and so they do. Anything to feel lonely no more. But for many of these girls, the new identity provides no cure. The distress that catalyzed their gender journeys remains. There is no hack for adolescence. We push and scream through its blinding confusion because there is no choice but to grow up. Now, to discuss another subject plaguing our youth. Teenage suicide. Teenage suicide in young girls is at an all-time high, as the amount of time young teenage girls spend glued to Instagram, TikTok, and other social media sites goes up, so does their long-term risk for suicide, a new study warns. The finding stems from a decade spent tracking social habits and suicide risk among 5 teenage boys and girls, the longest such effort to date, the study author says. We found that girls who started using social media at 2 to 3 hours a day or more at age 13, and then increased that use over time, had the highest levels of suicide risk in emerging adulthood, said the study author Sarah Coyne. She is Associate Director of the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. Among boys, however, no such pattern emerged. One reason why is that the social media and young girls tend to focus on the same thing, relationships. Boys, not so much. We know that girls tend to feel an internalized relationship distress at different levels than boys, said Cohen. This type of relationship distress can, but not always, be present in social media interactions. Girls also have higher levels of social comparison, fear of missing out, etc. So that is why the effects were likely stronger for girls. For the study, annual surveys were conducted between 2009 and 2019, with teens aged 14 on average at the study's launch. Most of the risk pertained to girls who, as young adolescents, were already spending a lot of time using social media, TV, and video games. As their screen time increased over the years, so did their risk for suicide by the time they hit their early to mid-20s, the findings showed. But might teenage depression increase social media use and ultimately suicide risk? Or is it the other way around? Cohen said the kind of classic chicken and egg question remains open to debate. The latest study didn't prove cause and effect, she noted, though she suggested it's likely a two-way street. Findings were published recently in the Journal of Youth and Adolescence. More research is needed on this front, said Dr. Alicia Buckle-Hammond, a research fellow in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. Buckle-Hammond noted that while depression prior to the first survey was noted, the team did not look at how depression symptoms changed over time, so they can't say whether the girls were becoming more depressed and therefore using more electronic media like social media, TV, and video games, or whether using these types of media caused the increase in depression and suicidality. Meanwhile, Cohen said screen time is likely only one small factor contributing to suicide risk, alongside other issues, such as feelings of exclusion and invisibility, that could impact risk outside of a social media context. As for what parents can do, Cohen's team does not advise cutting off all access to social media among young girls. Instead, delay the start of using social media until at least age 13, and then start with low levels that only moderately increase over time, Cohen suggested. This pattern was fairly protective for suicide risk over time. Also, talk to your child about their experiences around social media, helping them to be mindful of what they are feeling. Those thoughts were seconded by Vogelherman, who noted that increasing screen time can be a warning sign of a bigger teenage problem. This is particularly true if their media use is taking up a lot of their time. It's taking them away from doing things they used to enjoy, or it's causing distress, Vogelherman said. Parents and teens should be open about the amount of type of media they're using so that they can look out for warning signs, talk about worsening mood or suicidality, and reach out for help, she added. It's also helpful to have some common sense limits around electronic media use. For example, limiting use to less than 2 hours per day, not using electronic media after a certain time at night since it can worsen sleep, and having open discussions about online bullying and online safety, Vogelhammer said. We hope that the following video was informative and eye-opening for those of you with teenage daughters who are experiencing gender dysphoria. We would suggest doing your research on how you can help your children get through this emotional state of mind. For more insight, you can purchase Abigail Shriber's book, Irreversible Damage, on Amazon. Link is down below. If you like this video, do give it a like and hit that subscribe button, as your support helps us create more content. Your feedback and comments are appreciated, and we will respond to any questions or concerns you may have for us. Cheers.